Clara Whitmore did not cry when her uncle sold her. She had no tears left. She stood in the hallway of Ashford Estate, wearing a mended dress and carrying a suitcase held shut with rope, and she looked at the man who had purchased her debt and her future, without flinching. Nay, she would not beg, she would not break, and when the Duke of Ashford crossed the room and placed something in her hand, she had no idea that one small gesture would be the beginning of everything she never believed she deserved. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment below, tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1815 arrived in Harrowfield County, Virginia, where most unwanted things did, without warning and without apology. The heat over the county like a hand pressed flat against the earth, heavy and suffocating, baking the red clay roads into hard cracked lines that split open like old wounds. The fields outside town shimmered. The courthouse square sat quiet in the middle of the afternoon, the kind of quiet that had teeth in it. Inside the offices of Reginald Whitmore, 3 men sat around a table that had seen better decades. Reginald himself occupied the chair at the head, a man shaped like a barrel that had gone soft in the middle, with small eyes set too close together and a habit of moistening his lips before he spoke that Clara had hated since she was 7 years old. Beside him sat Mr. Harlan, Cook County's most persistent debt collector, a thin man with the paper, dry skin and the kind of patience that only came to men who had learned that waiting always paid better than rushing. And at the far end of the table, a ledger open before him, sat a man named Silas Pruitt, who worked as Reginald's accountant and had never once in his life told the truth if a lie would serve him better. Clara stood in the doorway. She had not been invited. She had been summoned, which was a different thing entirely. "Sit down," her uncle said, without looking up. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She kept her face perfectly still, the way her mother had taught her, the way poor women learned to hold themselves when they walked into rooms full of men who had already decided what they were worth. A Cook's throat. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I assume your uncle has explained the situation." "He has not," Clara said. Reginald made a sound low in his throat. "I was getting to it. You've had 3 days," Clara said. "Since my father's funeral." The room went quiet in a particular way, the way rooms went quiet when a woman said something that men found inconvenient. Cook unfolded a document and set it flat on the table. "Your father's debts, Miss Whitmore. Total outstanding balance as of this week $4,200. Did not move. She had known the debt existed. She had not known the number. It sat in her chest now like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings she could feel but couldn't stop. Figure. That did. Cook continued, in smoothing the edge of the document with one dry finger, "is owed to 3 separate creditors, of which my employer holds the largest portion. You've been patient. Considerably patient. But patience has a limit, Miss Whitmore, and I'm afraid yours has been reached." "What does that mean?" Clara said. It was not a question. She already knew what it meant. She just wanted to make them say it out loud. "It means," Reginald said, leaning back in his chair and looking at a point somewhere above her head, "that we've found a solution." "Is a man," Cook said. "A gentleman of considerable means. He's agreed to purchase the outstanding debt in full. Every penny. In exchange for what?" Clara said. Cook paused. He glanced at Reginald. Reginald studied the ceiling. "In exchange for your hand in marriage," Cook said. "Legal contract. You would become his wife. The debt would be erased. Uncle would retain the Whitmore property. And you would—" "I would what?" Clara said quietly. "You would be provided for," Cook finished, as though that were a gift. Clara looked at her uncle. Reginald Whitmore, the man who had eaten at her father's table for 20 years and borrowed money from him for 15 of those years and wept at his funeral 4 days ago with a handkerchief pressed to his face. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had already moved past feeling bad about this and arrived at a place of considerable comfort with his own decision. "Who is the man?" Clara said. William Harlan Ashford, Cook said. Duke of Ashford. He holds Ashford Estate some 11 miles north. You'll know the property. It runs along the ridge past Caldwell Creek. She knew it. Everyone in the county knew it. The house sat up on that ridge like a fist clenched against the sky, dark stone and iron gates, and the kind of silence around it that people interpreted according to their own fears. The Duke of Ashford was 38 years old, widowed, and had not attended a county social event in 6 years. And people said things about him the way people always said things about powerful men who didn't bother to court their approval. They said he was cold. They said he didn't smile. They said his first wife had died of unhappiness. Clara did not know how much of any of it was true. She knew only that she was 23 years old, sitting in a room where 3 men had just decided her future, and not one of them had thought to ask her what she wanted. "I need a moment," she said. Clara Reginald started. "A moment," she said, and walked out. She stood in the hallway outside the office door with her back against the plaster wall and her eyes fixed on the opposite wall, and she breathed. 3 times. Her father had been a good man. A careful man, mostly, except for the times he wasn't, and those times had cost him. She did not blame him for dying and leaving her with a hole she couldn't fill. She did not blame him for the debt. She blamed Reginald for the years of owing, and the years of not repaying, and the years of telling her father everything would work itself out, brother. Don't worry, it'll work itself out. It had not worked itself out. What it had done was work itself into this hallway, this afternoon, at this moment, where the question was not whether she would be sold, but only whether she had enough voice left in her to say something true before she was. She went go, she said. Under one condition. Ook raised an eyebrow. Reginald looked surprised, as though she'd returned from the hallway as someone slightly different. Don't set conditions, Reginald said. I do, Clara said. Because you need my signature on that contract as much as I need the debt cleared. No, but I speak to the man himself before I sign anything. Not through lawyers, not through letters. I speak to William Ashford face to face, and he speaks to me the same way, and then I decide. The room was very quiet. Cook looked at his document. That can be arranged, he said finally. Reginald said nothing. Clara sat back down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Had 3 days. She used them the way she used most hard things, by working through them. She helped Mrs. Dunmore in the kitchen. She repaired the tear along the hem of her good dress, the blue one her mother had made years ago from fabric bought at the Greenfield market, now faded to a color that sat somewhere between blue and gray but still held its shape. She packed what she owned: 2 dresses, a shawl, her mother's Bible, with the pressed flower still inside the front cover, a small tin of sewing things, and the miniature portrait of her parents that she'd carried since she was 12. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She had learned that lesson early. You could destroy yourself imagining disasters that hadn't happened yet. Better to get to the thing and find out what it actually was. On the 3rd morning, Cook's man came with a carriage. Clara walked out of the Whitmore house with her rope-tied suitcase and did not look back. Ashford Estate announced itself before you could see it. The drive was lined with old oaks, the kind that had been growing for 100 years and had stopped caring what anyone thought about them. Their camp closed overhead in a long tunnel of shade and green light that Clara found, against her expectations, genuinely beautiful. The gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels. Somewhere a bird called twice and fell silent. Then the trees opened, and the house was there. It was larger than she'd expected, and older-looking, built from dark stone that had absorbed decades of Virginia weather, and turned a shade somewhere between gray and brown. The windows were tall and uncurtained on the upper floors. The ironwork on the gate and along the front steps was elaborate, but not ostentatious. Someone cared very much about this house. That person had not, for some years now, doing the caring. Clara took all of this in without expression. The carriage stopped. A man came down the front steps, not a servant, though she'd expected a servant. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that fit well but without any particular effort toward impressing. Hair was dark, with threads of gray at the temples. Ate without hurrying. He had the walk of a man who had never once in his life rushed toward anything and saw no reason to start. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her. Looked at him. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low. Not unkind. "Mr. Ashford," she said, stepping down from the carriage without waiting for assistance. "Or your grace, I'm told." "Either one," he said. "I don't require ceremony." She stood before him, in her faded blue dress with her rope-tied suitcase, and met his eyes directly, and he looked back at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not surprise, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Yeah. As though he had formed an expectation since she had already failed to match it, and he hadn't decided yet whether that was a problem. "Wanted to speak first," he said. "I did, then come inside." The room he brought her to was plainly furnished and cool. A table, 4 chairs, windows that looked out over the back of the property where the land fell away toward the creek. He did not offer tea. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and waited. Clara had thought about what she wanted to say. She had thought about it through 3 nights and 2 long silences and the entire length of that oak-lined drive. "Understand the arrangement," she said. "My uncle owes money. The debt, I marry you. The ledger balances." "That's the arrangement," he said. "I want to know why," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why what? Why you agreed to it?" "You don't need a wife for money. You don't appear to need one for social standing, since you seem to have stopped caring about that." "Why?" Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite irritation. "I have a property," he said. "It requires management. It requires someone who can manage it properly. I've found that bachelor dukes become objects of considerable local attention. A wife resolves that. A housekeeper would resolve it more cleanly," Clara said. "A housekeeper doesn't carry the same legal weight. And a woman sold to pay her family's debts does." He met her eyes. "I suppose you want me to apologize for the circumstances." "I don't want anything from you," Clara said. "That's what I want you to understand before we go any further." "Yeah. I'm not grateful. I'm not going to be grateful. You're not rescuing me. You're acquiring a wife through a financial transaction, same as you'd acquire land." "I understand that. I want you to understand that I understand it." William Ashford looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Most people would have the sense to be at least somewhat diplomatic in this position." "Most people in this position don't have anything left to lose by being honest," Clara said. Another pause. "Fair point," he said. "I'll marry you," Clara said. "I'll manage your household. I'll conduct myself appropriately in public. I won't embarrass you. But I won't pretend this was my choice, and I won't pretend to feel things I don't feel, and I won't be managed or diminished. Those are my terms." She expected resistance. She had prepared herself for it, the cold withdrawal, the reminder of exactly who held the power in this room, in this transaction, in the state. What she did not expect was for William Ashford to sit back in his chair and say very quietly, "All right." She blinked. "All right. I have no interest in pretending either," he said. "This is a legal arrangement. You've stated your terms. They're reasonable. I'll state mine. I ask that you not involve yourself in the business affairs of the estate without consulting me. That you are present at the quarterly county gatherings, which I cannot avoid attending." And that he paused briefly. "Attempt to make this into something it isn't." Clara almost said, "You mean a marriage," but she stopped herself. "Agreed," she said instead. "Then we'll sign the papers this afternoon." She nodded. He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the plain table in the cool room, with the windows behind them both, and the silence between them was careful and strange. The way silences were between people who had just agreed to share a life without sharing anything else. "One more thing," she said. "Your first wife," she said. "Ain't know what happened, and I won't ask. But I want you to know I'm not her, and I won't be treated as though I might be." Something happened in his face then. Fast and gone before she could read it properly. A tightening, something that went deep. Understood, he said. And that was how it began. The wedding was not an event. It was a ceremony conducted in the front parlor of Ashford Estate on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, attended by the estate's solicitor, 2 witnesses from town, and a minister who drove 11 miles and charged a reasonable fee and kept his expression professionally neutral throughout. And Clara wore the blue dress. She had replaced the hem stitching with something stronger and brushed the fabric until it was as clean as it was going to get. She carried her mother's Bible. She stood beside Iversford and spoke the words she was asked to speak, and he spoke his, and when the minister said it was done, it was done. She did not cry. Nair. She had wondered, in the days before, whether she would not from sentiment, but from the sheer accumulated weight of everything. The loss of her father, the loss of the life she'd thought she might eventually have. The particular grief of being 23 years old and watching your future be arranged by someone else. But she was dry-eyed and steady, and she shook the solicitor's hand when it was offered, and thanked the minister and watched the witnesses sign the documents and thought, "All right. It is what it is. Now find out what it actually is." The household staff received her that evening. There were 6 of them. Hester, the housekeeper, a woman in her mid-50s with iron-gray hair, pinned tightly and eyes that watched and waited. Thomas, head groom, a quiet man with weathered hands. 2 kitchen women named Ruth and Bess, who were sisters, and evidently spent a significant portion of their time disagreeing with each other. Groundskeeper named Old Walter, who appeared to be approximately 70, and had the expression of a man who had outlasted several dynasties and fully expected to outlast a few more, and a young housemaid named Molly, maybe 16, who looked at Clara with enormous eyes and appeared to be operating on the theory that the new mistress might at any moment either burst into tears or perform some other dramatic act. Clara shook each of their hands. Hester's handshake was firm and measuring. Clara met her eyes and held them, and something passed between them, 2 women taking stock of each other. And then Hester said, "Welcome to Ashford Estate, ma'am," and it wasn't quite warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was the statement of a woman willing to form her own opinion in her own time. "Thank you," Clara said. "I hope we'll work well together. To learn how the house runs, and I'd appreciate your help with that." Esther looked at her for one more moment, then gave a short nod. That was enough for now. He gave her a room. Not the room connected to his. She'd half expected that, had steeled herself for whatever that conversation would require. But it was a separate room, on the same floor but at the far end of the hall, with its own window looking over the eastern side of the property. On the small table inside that room, when she went in that first evening to unpack her rope-tied suitcase, she found something she hadn't put there. A key, heavy, old-fashioned iron, the kind that belonged to an estate's library or study. A single folded note. She picked it up and opened it. The handwriting was careful, and without flourish. "The library is at the end of the east corridor. You may use it whenever you wish. The key is yours to keep." Clara stood there in the evening light, holding the key and the note, and she thought about what it meant, not romantically, not hopefully. Not with any of the soft, warm interpretation she'd read in the novels her mother had kept on the shelf at home. She thought about it practically. He had noticed, in the space of one afternoon's conversation, that she was a woman who read. Who would need somewhere to put her mind when the rest of this arrangement pressed down on her? He had given her a room within a room, a door she could open and close herself. It was not kindness exactly. It was something more complicated, the gesture of a man who had spent a long time watching people carefully and had not, despite everything, stopped understanding what they needed. Clara folded the note precisely and set it on the table. She set the key beside her mother's Bible. She sat down on the edge of the bed and let herself for exactly 1 minute feel how afraid she was. Then she stood up, unpacked her suitcase, hung her dresses. Set the tin of sewing things on the windowsill, put the small portrait of her parents on the table where she could see it from the bed. She was still afraid. But she was also, and this surprised her, still entirely herself. That would have to be enough. Nay, in the days that followed, Clara learned the shape of her new life the way you learned any unfamiliar territory carefully, without assumptions, paying attention to what the land was actually telling you, rather than what you expected it to say. Ashford Estate ran on a schedule so precise it might have been mechanical. Breakfast at 7, estate business from 8 to noon, the midday meal, afternoon business or correspondence, upper at 6, evenings belonging to whoever had them. William appeared at meals and was civil and occasionally briefly, something approaching conversational, Then he was gone again into whatever occupied him, the accounts, the correspondence, the business of managing 1,100 acres of Virginia farmland in a county that had opinions about everything and the leisure to argue them at length. Clara did not try to insert herself into that work. She had said she wouldn't, and she meant it. What she did do was learn the household. She walked every room within the first 3 days, not intrusively, just carefully, the way you walked a space you were going to live in and needed to understand. She spoke to Hester about the household accounts, about what was ordered and from where and when, about the staff's schedules and the house's particular quirks. Way the kitchen chimney drew slow in humid weather, and the east cellar needed checking for damp after heavy rain. Hester watched her ask these questions with the careful attention of a woman who had worked for the Ashford household for 19 years and formed strong opinions about the people who entered it. On the 4th day, Hester brought her the household ledger without being asked. "Thought you'd want to look it over," she said. Clara took it. "Thank you. You're the first one who's asked about the chimney," Hester said, not quite casually. Clara looked up. "The other one," Hester said carefully, neither cruel nor kind. She didn't like the house much. "It was too far from town." "I don't need town," Clara said. "No," Hester said. "I didn't reckon you did." She left. Clara opened the ledger. The library, when she finally went to it on the 5th evening, was the finest room in the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, crammed and overflowing, books stacked horizontally on top of books standing vertically, a whole arrangement suggesting a long history of acquisition and not quite enough space. A wide reading chair beside the window, a lamp on the side table. The smell of old paper and leather, and the particular quiet of a room that had held a great many thoughts. She stood in the middle of it and turned slowly once, just to look. She heard footsteps in the doorway. William Ashford leaned against the frame. He had apparently been passing and seen the light under the door. "Found it useful?" "It's magnificent," she said. Something moved across his face, not pride, exactly, but something that responded to the words nevertheless. "My father's collection, mostly," he said. "I've added to it." "You've run out of shelf space." "Some time ago," he said. A pause. Not uncomfortable. Just the space between two people who hadn't quite figured out how to talk to each other yet. "Read law," he said then, unexpectedly, "when I was younger. Before it became clear the estate would need me here. Now I read history, mostly, and agricultural theory, which is considerably less interesting but more useful." Clara looked at the shelves. "There's a whole section of philosophy near the east window." "You've already catalogued it." "I catalog things when I'm in new places," she said. "It helps." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that same careful expression she'd seen in their first meeting, the expression of a man who kept his reactions at a measured distance from his face. "I'll leave you to it," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said, before she'd entirely decided to. He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for the key." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm choosing to." Something shifted in him again, that fast, deep thing she couldn't fully read. He nodded once and left. Clara turned back to the shelves. She pulled a volume of Blackstone's Commentaries from the 3rd row. She sat down in the reading chair. She opened the book. Outside the windows, the Virginia summer night was thick and warm and full of sound, and somewhere in the house, William Ashford walked back to whatever room held him. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived 3 days ago as payment for a debt she hadn't owed, sat in the library of Ashford Estate and read, and breathed. And slowly, quietly, against all expectation, began to feel something that was not happiness. Not yet, not even close, but was at least the distant shape of it. Something that said you are still here. You are still yourself. That counts for something. Let it count for something. The second week at Ashford Estate arrived without ceremony, the way most things did in that house quietly, then, without announcement, simply there. When you turned around to look, Clara had begun to understand the rhythms of the place. Not just the mechanical ones, the breakfast bell, the evening supper, the particular creak of the third stair from the top that announced William's descent each morning at 10 minutes before 7, but the deeper rhythms. The ones that told you how a house actually lived, as opposed to how it presented itself. Ashford Estate was a house that had forgotten what ease felt like. She noticed it in small things. Way the staff moved through rooms efficiently? Yes, professionally, but with a particular kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was the quiet of people accustomed to keeping themselves invisible. Molly, the young housemaid, had a habit of flattening herself against walls when William passed through a corridor, as though she half expected some consequence for simply existing in his proximity. The head groom spoke to Clara about the horses with genuine warmth, but the moment William Ashford entered the stable yard, in Thomas shifted a closing down, a careful attention to neutral expression. They weren't afraid of him, exactly. It was more than that. They had learned, over some period of time, not to expect anything from him, warmth or otherwise, and they had adapted to that expectation. The people adapted to hard winters. They dressed for it. They moved through it. They did not take it personally. Clara found this more troubling than outright coldness would have been. She was thinking about it one morning in the kitchen, sitting across from Ruth and Bess, who were in the middle of their ongoing disagreement about whether the bread needed more salt. When Hester set a cup of coffee in front of her, without being asked, and said, "You've got that look." "What look is that?" Clara said. "The one where you're working something out," Hester said. "You've had it 4 days running." "I'm always working something out," Clara said. "This one's particular, Hester said, and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was a thing she had not done before. Had been professional and helpful and present, but had maintained the measured distance of a woman, waiting to see whether the new arrangement would last before she invested herself in it. The fact that she sat down now meant something. "How long has the staff been this way?" Clara said. Esther looked at her steadily. "What way?" "Careful," Clara said. "Tucked in, like they've learned not to take up too much space." Esther was quiet for a long moment. Ruth and Bess had gone very still at the work table behind them, not pretending to work, just listening. "Since Mrs. Ashford," Hester said finally. "The first one." Clara waited. "She wasn't a cruel woman," Hester said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. She was unhappy. And unhappy people, sometimes they take up all the air in a room without meaning to." Staff learned to stay small. And then she was gone, and he closed up. And closed up people, they take up a different kind of space. Quiet space, she paused. So they stayed small. "It's been 6 years. Clara looked down at her coffee. "He doesn't raise his voice," she said. "He doesn't. He isn't cruel." "No," Hester said. "He's not. He's fair. He pays good wages and he doesn't mistreat anyone." "But fair isn't the same as warm. And the staff, they're young, most of them. Molly especially. They don't know what warm looks like in this house." Clara looked up. What did it look like before? Hester's expression shifted, something old and briefly visible. "Other," she said. "She was warm. She died when he was 14. She shook her head. "He was shaped by this place. The way children are shaped by what's around them when they're still soft." Clara thought about a 14-year-old boy in this stone house, going quiet and careful, and learning to take up no more space than was strictly necessary. She thought about how that became a man. "Thank you," she said quietly. "And me. I didn't tell you so you'd feel sorry for him." Hester said, crisp and direct. I know, Clara said. I told you because Hester stopped. Considered. Because the house needs something been missing for a long time. And I think you might be the kind of woman who could give it, if you decide to. Clara looked at her. I didn't come here by choice, she said. No, Hester said. But you're here. She smoothed her apron. Most things that matter didn't start as a choice. She went back to her work. Ruth and Bess resumed their salt argument. Clara sat with her coffee going cold in her hands, and something Hester had said settling in her chest like a stone, finding its place at the bottom of a stream. She was here. That was the fact of it. She could spend the next however many years in this house treating it as a sentence as the arrangement it had been designed as, transactional and without warmth. Her doing her portion, and him doing his, and the cold distance between them, remaining exactly as cold and exactly as distant as it had started. Or she could be here, actually be here, in the way her mother had always said a person ought to be present, paying attention, doing the thing in front of you with all of yourself, not half of yourself held back in case you needed it later. She picked up her coffee, drank it cold, went to find Molly. The girl was in the upstairs corridor, trying to rehang a curtain rod that had come loose from the wall. She was doing it badly. The wall bracket was stripped and needed a different anchor, which she clearly didn't know, and she was wrestling with the curtain in a way that was going to end with either the rod or Molly on the floor. Stop, Clara said. You'll pull it through. Molly froze, eyes wide. I'm sorry, ma'am, it came loose on its own. I wasn't. I know, Clara said. The bracket's stripped. You need a larger anchor. Do you know where Thomas keeps his tools? Yes, ma'am, in the stable workshop. Go get a larger anchor bolt and a good screwdriver. Ollie stared at her. Go on, Clara said. She went. Clara stood in the corridor, holding the curtain rod with both hands, the curtain bunched over her arms, and waited. 10 minutes later, Molly came back with the tools, slightly out of breath, and watched with visible amazement as Clara set the rod down, worked the old stripped bracket out of the wall, installed the new anchor correctly, and reattached the bracket. How do you know that? Molly said. My father's house had old walls, Clara said. Learn. She handed Molly the screwdriver. Now you finish it. You need to know how to do this, not just watch someone else do it. Molly took the screwdriver. She looked at it. She looked at Clara. Then she set the bracket against the new anchor and began to tighten it, and she got it wrong twice, and Clara told her how to correct it, and she corrected it, and by the time the curtain rod was hanging level and solid in the wall, Aunt was standing a half-inch taller than she had been when this started. Thank you, ma'am, she said. Next time you know how, Clara said. That's the point. She gathered the tools to return to Thomas and was halfway down the corridor when she heard something behind her. She turned. William Ashford was standing at the far end of the hall. He had come up from the study, apparently, and had been there long enough to have seen at least some of this, and his expression was doing that careful, unreadable thing it did. He looked at her for a moment across the length of the corridor. Then he looked at Molly. Then he said to the girl mildly, "Good work." Molly looked like she'd been handed a sovereign. He walked back to the study. Clara watched him go and thought, there it is, hidden under all that careful stone, but there. Like a fire banked so low you could forget it was a fire at all, until you crouched down and held your hand out and felt the heat. It was still there. The county's opinion of Clara Whitmore arrived before she'd been at Ashford Estate 2 weeks, and it arrived in the form of Eleanor Beaumont. Anne. Clara heard the carriage. First she was in the garden, which she had started visiting in the mornings because the garden was in a state of significant neglect, and it offended something in her to watch growing things be ignored. She was not yet doing anything about it. She was just looking, the way you looked at a problem before you decided how to approach it. The carriage that came through the estate gates was impressive, in a specific way, the kind of impressive that was designed to be noticed. Black lacquer, brass fittings, a matched pair. Eleanor Beaumont stepped down from it with the practiced ease of a woman who had been making entrances for 25 years and expected the world to arrange itself accordingly. She was beautiful. Clara noticed this without resentment and without insecurity, the way you noticed whether it was simply a fact. Yale, composed, wearing a dress that cost more than Clara's father had made in a good year, with dark hair dressed perfectly and eyes the color of winter ice. She saw Clara standing in the garden, and she paused and she smiled. The smile did not reach the eyes. "You must be the new Mrs. Ashford," she said. "I am," Clara said. She did not curtsy. She had not been raised to curtsy to women who smiled like that. "Eleanor Beaumont," the woman said. "I'm a very old friend of William's." "I hope he's mentioned me." He had not. "He mentioned you might call," Clara said evenly, which was a lie but a useful one. Eleanor's smile held. "I thought it only right to welcome you properly." It must be quite an adjustment from Whitmore to Ashford. She let that sit for a moment, just long enough. "Such a different kind of life. Every new house takes some getting used to," Clara said. "Of course," Eleanor said, "though I imagine some are easier than others." "William's particular about his household. He always has been." She glanced at the garden, the neglected beds, the overgrown paths. "Nah. Though I see things have gotten a little loose since Margaret." Margaret, the first wife's name delivered like a card placed on a table. Ate looked at Eleanor Beaumont steadily and thought, "You have done this before. You have done this to women before this one, and you are very good at it." "I find," Clara said, "that things left loose for a while tend to benefit from careful attention. I expect the garden will look quite different by autumn." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, the tiniest recalibration. She had expected what? Flinching, apology, the particular retreating anxiety of a woman who knows she doesn't belong and can be made to feel it. Clara gave her none of it. "How charming," Eleanor said. "Well, I won't keep you from your project." She moved toward the house. "I'll just go in and see William. We have a great deal to catch up on." She went inside. Clara stood in the garden and breathed once through her nose and reminded herself that this was a long game, and the first move belonged to Eleanor, and that was fine. That was expected. The question was what the second move looked like. She found out at supper. William was at the head of the table. Eleanor had apparently accepted an invitation to stay or had invited herself, which seemed more likely, and occupied the chair to his right with the ease of a woman who had sat in that particular spot many times before. She spoke to William with the familiar fluency of long acquaintance, referencing names Clara didn't know and events Clara hadn't been present for, and did it with the particular skill of someone who wasn't trying to exclude Clara so much as to make her understand, very gently, that exclusion was simply the natural result of the circumstances. Clara ate her supper. She listened. She did not try to insert herself into conversations that weren't meant for her. But at a certain point Eleanor said, addressing the table generally, "I was telling Mrs. Hargrove just last week, you know how she worries about propriety, that William had managed a very practical arrangement. Sometimes these things are simply matters of necessity." A small pause. "She was rather concerned, given the circumstances." William said nothing. He was cutting his meat and looking at his plate. Clara set down her fork. "What circumstances would those be?" she said. Eleanor turned to her with the smooth attentiveness of someone who had been waiting for that exact question. "Oh, the debt, the rather unconventional nature of how things were arranged. People talk, especially in a county this size. I do hope it hasn't been too uncomfortable for you, Mrs. Ashford." "I find," Clara said, "that people who worry about unconventional arrangements usually don't have enough interesting things happening in their own lives." A short silence. "Clara," William said, not a warning, more of a careful observation, like a man noting which way the wind was turning. "Mrs. Hargrove is a pillar of county society," Eleanor said. 18, still pleasant. The inn, still smooth. "I'm sure she is," Clara said. "And I'm also sure that a woman who has managed to concern herself with the domestic arrangements of a household she's never visited has a remarkable amount of spare time." She picked up her fork again. "The veal is very good tonight." Ruth outdid herself. The silence at the table had a particular quality now, the quality of a silence in which something cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is deciding what to do with it. William looked up from his plate. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Clara. His expression was entirely illegible, and Clara felt, for one uncertain moment, that she had miscalculated, that she had stepped too far, and he said too much, undone whatever careful neutrality she had been building. Nan. Then he said, Eleanor. Me. Very quietly, the arrangement, as you call it, is a marriage. Clara is my wife. I'd appreciate it if Mrs. Hargrove understood that distinction. Eleanor's pleasant expression did not waver, but something behind it did. Of course, she said. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. William said, and returned to his supper. Clara returned to hers. She did not look at him. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at her plate and kept her breathing even, and felt something she hadn't expected, a kind of warmth, quick and unbidden, spreading through the center of her chest. Small, but real. He had said it. She is my wife. Not my arrangement. Not the woman I married for practical purposes. His wife, said to Eleanor Beaumont with the quiet finality of a man who did not often say things he didn't mean. Clara took a breath and picked up her wineglass and thought. All right. So that is also who he is. Eleanor Beaumont left the following morning, and whatever she said to Mrs. Hargrove and to the other county aunts in the weeks that followed, Clara would never know directly. What she knew was what arrived as consequence, the invitations that didn't come, curtailed conversation, at the 2 county events they attended in July, the way women of a certain standing looked at her, not with hostility, exactly. More with the practiced social distance of people who had decided to reserve judgment and were making very sure Clara felt the reservation. She had expected this. She had grown up without money in a county that noticed money. She knew the shape of this particular cold. What she had not expected was Ruth. She found out by accident. She was passing the kitchen doorway on a Thursday morning when she heard Ruth's voice, not the usual good-natured arguing, but something lower, sharper, aimed at someone. She stopped, listened. Don't care what they're saying in town, Ruth was saying, with considerable heat. Yeah. Those women have never worked a day in their combined lives, and they're sitting there with their opinions about a woman who came here with nothing and has done nothing but work hard and treat everyone in this house decently. You tell me where the shame is in that. A pause. Then Bess, Mrs. Hargrove says she married him for the money. Mrs. Hargrove couldn't find the kitchen in her own house, Ruth said flatly. She has a cook for that. Clara stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she walked past the doorway without stopping. But she was smiling. She didn't mean to be. It happened before she could stop it. Twist came on a Saturday in late July, and it came from a direction Clara had not anticipated. She was in the library. It had become hers, in a way that happened quietly, without declaration, the way the best things in her life always had when she heard raised voices. Not loud exactly. The house was too composed for loud. Elevated, and coming from the direction of the study. Recognized one voice as William's, the other she didn't know. She did not go to listen at the door. She stayed in her chair and held her book open and acknowledged, with a private honesty she allowed herself in that room, that she was listening anyway. She couldn't make out words. She could make out tone, William's voice, controlled but stripped of its usual flatness, something underneath it that she had not heard before. Anger, yes, but beneath the anger something that sounded like pain. And the other voice older, she thought, male, patient and methodical, in the way of someone presenting facts. It went on for 20 minutes. Then the front door opened and closed. Clara stayed where she was. 15 minutes later, she heard footsteps in the corridor, William's footsteps. She knew them now, and they stopped outside the library door. A pause. Then the door opened. He looked worse than she had ever seen him, not disheveled. He wouldn't allow himself dishevelment, but something beneath the surface was different. Something that usually held very still in him was moving. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, and she thought he was going to say something about the voices, something explanatory and controlled, The kind of thing you said to restore normal appearances. Instead, do you play chess? Clara blinked. I do. He crossed to the cabinet near the window that she had always assumed held estate documents. He opened it and produced a chessboard in pieces, aged and clearly well used. He brought it to the table between the chairs, set it down, and began laying out the pieces without looking at her. Clara set her book aside. She sat across from him. She laid out her pieces. They played for 2 hours without speaking, except to move and to occasionally note a move that required acknowledging. He played Diebold aggressively and with precision, the way she suspected he did most things. Clara played more slowly, more patiently, watching the whole board rather than her own pieces. In the first game, he looked up from the board, looked at her. You've played seriously. My father taught me, she said. He said it was the best way to learn how someone thinks. He paused. Again, yes, she said. In the second game, barely. They played a third that ended in a draw neither of them had planned, and by the time they were resetting the board, Clara realized that whatever had been in him when he walked into this room 2 hours ago, that tight, moving, pained thing had been set down somewhere during the games. Not resolved, just set down long enough for him to breathe. He understood that. She understood exactly that. Are you going to tell me what happened, she said. Not pushing, just offering space for it. He looked at the board. He said, half-brother. He's contesting a portion of the estate. Claims our father's original will was modified improperly. He was quiet for a moment. Aim is. He stopped, started again. It may have merit. Clara was very still. How much of the estate? The eastern parcels? 100 acres, the Caldwell Creek land. He set a night down on the board. Picked it up again. It would also reopen questions about other things. About the nature of the estate's management since my father died. Out decisions I made. He looked at her directly. About the debt I purchased. The room shifted. Meaning, Clara said carefully. Nah. Meaning, he said, that if my brother's challenge proceeds and certain documents are re-examined, your uncle's debt and the arrangement that cleared it will be part of the public record. Examined in a county proceeding. He met her eyes. I wanted you to know, before you heard it from someone else. Clara set her queen down on the board. She thought about Reginald Whitmore. About a room with 3 men and a debt and a girl standing in the doorway who hadn't been invited. She thought about what it meant for all of that to be laid out in a county proceeding, in front of people who already thought they knew what she was. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, as though testing what she meant by it. I'm not ashamed of how I came here, she said. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't arrange any of it. So if it becomes public record, then it becomes public record, and people can think what they think, and it won't change what actually happened. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid, he said. I'm afraid of a great many things, she said. Reputation is not one of them. A beat. What are you afraid of? The question landed in the room and sat there. Losing something I'm still. He stopped. Something I haven't finished deciding what it is to me. Clara thought she understood him. She wasn't sure she was supposed to, or that he intended it. Understood. Then fight the claim, she said. Not fight it, she said with more force this time. If the claim doesn't hold, prove it doesn't hold. Get the right people to look at the right documents and prove it. Don't let someone take something from you because it's easier than standing up. He stared at her. You've been telling yourself this house is a burden, she said. A responsibility, a weight you carry. But you're angry right now about losing 200 acres, and that anger is real. So stop acting like this place doesn't matter to you. Does. Fight for it. Silence. Then you've known me less than a month. I've played 3 games of chess with you, she said. I know how you think. Something happened in his face then that she hadn't seen before, a fracture brief and real, in all that careful stone. Not grief, not quite, but close to it. the expression of a man who had spent years believing that no one was paying close enough attention to see him clearly, and had just discovered he was wrong. He looked down at the chessboard. "I'll speak to the solicitor Monday," he said very quietly. "Good," Clara said. She began resetting the board. After a moment, he reached across and moved his king back to its square. They played a fourth game. The summer night settled around the house, and somewhere outside old Walter was doing whatever old Walter did in the evenings. Aunt Molly had learned to hang a curtain rod, and Ruth was defending Clara's honor to her sister in the kitchen. And William Ashford, Duke of Ashford, master of a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like, was sitting across a chessboard from the woman who had arrived as a debt and was turning out to be something else entirely. Something he did not have a clean category for, and was beginning to think he might need one. He lost the fourth game. He didn't seem to mind. The solicitor's name was Graves, and he arrived on Monday morning, exactly when William said he would, which told Clara something about the kind of man William chose to work with: punctual, prepared, no wasted motion. She heard them go into the study. She did not try to listen this time. She went to the garden instead, where she had begun the slow work of reclaiming the beds from 2 summers of neglect, and she pulled weeds until her hands ached and her back complained, and her mind finally went quiet enough to think. The half-brother's name was Daniel Ashford. She had pieced this together from what William told her and what Hester had carefully not told her, which was sometimes more informative. Daniel was 7 years younger than William, the son of their father's second wife, a woman who had died young and left Daniel to be raised primarily by relatives in Georgia. He had not been close to William. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, been particularly interested in being close to William. He had his own money, his own property, his own life. Until now, until the claim. Clara dug her fingers into the soil and thought about that. A man who had his own life, suddenly deciding to contest his half-brother's estate. The timing of it not during the years immediately following their father's death, not when William was new to the dukedom and might have been easier to challenge, but now. 6 years later, after William had been alone in this house for 6 years. After William had acquired a debt and a wife and a legal arrangement that could look to the wrong kind of eyes, like financial irregularity. Someone had told Daniel this was a good time. The question was who. She was still thinking about it when Molly came out to find her. "Mr. Graves is asking for you, ma'am," Molly said. "Duke says he'd like you to come in." Clara looked up. "Meeting? Yes, ma'am." Molly hesitated. "Specifically you." Clara stood, brushed the dirt from her hands. Owed Molly inside. Graves was a small man with an enormous presence, the kind that came from decades of being the most prepared person in any room. He stood when Clara entered, gave a short professional bow, and waited for her to sit before he sat himself. William was behind the desk. He looked composed and careful, the way he always looked, but she could see the tension in the line of his jaw. "Mr. Graves has been reviewing the claim documents," William said. "I thought you should hear this." Graves opened the folder in front of him. The claim rests on 2 points. First, the assertion that the codicil added to Mr. Ashford Sr.'s will, in 1,809 3 months, before his death was improperly witnessed. The original witnesses have since died, which complicates verification. He paused. The second point is where it becomes more particular. He looked at Clara. The claim also argues that certain financial decisions made by the Duke in the past 18 months represent a pattern of irregular management. The purchase of Mr. Reginald Whitmore's debt, specifically, is cited as evidence. The argument being that money was removed from its liquid holdings to acquire a personal obligation that has no clear benefit to the estate itself. Kept her face still. "They're using the debt," she said. "Not a question. As one element, yes," Graves said. "Meaning they're using our marriage as evidence that William mismanaged the estate." "That is the argument Daniel Ashford's legal representative is making." "Yes." Clara looked at William. He was looking at her with that careful, measured expression. But underneath it she could see something working, the particular discomfort of a man who had done something for his own reasons, and now had to watch it be described as something else entirely in public documents. "I want to be clear," Clara said to Graves. "The debt my uncle owed was legitimate. The marriage contract was legal. Every document was properly witnessed and filed." "Is not in dispute," Graves said. "The dispute is about the wisdom of the expenditure, not its legality. In a contested estate proceeding, wisdom is unfortunately also subject to examination." "What does Daniel want?" William said. "Not legally." "What does he actually want?" Graves was quiet for a moment. "Based on the communications from his representative, I believe he wants the eastern parcels. Aldwell Creek land specifically. He has a buyer." "He wants to sell it," William said. "He wants his portion of an estate he believes he was improperly excluded from, yes. Eastern parcels are the most liquid asset, easiest to sell, clearest boundary, least entangled with the operational holdings. And if I give him the eastern parcels, the claim goes away," Graves said simply. "It is, at its heart, a negotiation conducted through legal threat." The room was quiet. Clara watched William's face. Nay. She watched him weigh at the 200 acres against the cost of the fight, the public examination, the documents, the scrutiny. "But don't give it to him," she said. Both men looked at her. "If the claim has no merit, don't give him anything. Because if you give him what he's asking for under threat, you've told him and anyone else watching that threatening you works." She looked at William directly. "The next claim won't wait 6 years. Graves made a small sound that might, in a less composed man, have been approval. William looked at her for a long moment. "You understand there will be a proceeding?" "I understand," she said. "I'm not afraid of a proceeding. Your name will be in the documents." "My name is already in the documents," she said. "It's been there since we signed the contract. I'm your wife." "My name belongs in the documents." Something shifted in William's expression, that fast, deep thing. Then he turned to Graves. "We contest the claim. Full proceeding. I want every document from 1809 examined. Every witness statement. Every record of the codicil. Find me something solid. I'll begin Monday." "You began Monday," William said. "You began when you walked in that door." Graves allowed himself the smallest possible smile. "Yes, Your Grace, I did." He gathered his papers and stood. "I'll see myself out." The study went quiet. "Me." William and Clara sat across the desk from each other, and the air between them had changed, had shifted in some way that was hard to name precisely. Something had been said in there that went beyond legal strategy. Something about whose side she was on. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Graves has been my solicitor for 11 years. Andal." "I'm not talking about Graves," she said. "I'm talking about being here, in this room, with you." "It matters." He was very still. "I made a bargain," she said, "when I agreed to this marriage, and one of my terms was that I wouldn't pretend. So I'm not going to pretend I don't have a stake in this, because I do. This is my house now, too, and I intend to act like it. Anne." William looked at her across the desk in the morning light, and Clara thought for a moment that she had said too much, gone past the careful boundary they'd been navigating, stepped into territory he hadn't invited her into. But he said, "All right, just that. All right," the same words he'd used the first day, when she'd laid out her terms. The same quiet acceptance. But it meant something different now. "I'll go finish the garden." "Clara," he said. She stopped. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at his desk, then at the window, then at her. It was the look of a man trying to locate a sentence he hadn't needed before and wasn't certain existed. "Thank you," he said finally. She held his gaze for one moment. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it. The trouble, when it came from a place she hadn't been watching. She had been watching Eleanor Beaumont. She had been watching the county social circles, the quiet exclusions, the pointed comments delivered with beautiful smiles. Then, she had been watching the legal challenge, the documents, the slow machinery of the proceeding Graves was building their defense around. She had not been watching her uncle. Nin. Reginald Whitmore arrived at Ashford Estate on a Thursday in early August, without announcement, without invitation, and with the particular energy of a man who believed he was owed something, and had finally worked up the nerve to come and collect it. Esther came to find Clara in the library. "Your uncle is in the front hall," she said, and her voice was controlled in a way that told Clara she had already formed a significant opinion about this visit. Clara set down her book. She went to the front hall. Reginald looked prosperous, in a way that sat badly on him. New coat, new boots, the kind of careful dressing up that announced effort. He had a hat in his hands that he was turning in circles, and when he saw Clara, he stopped turning it and produced his best expression of family warmth. "Hey, Clara." "Uncle Reginald," she said. The warmth in his expression was working very hard. "I was hoping we might speak." "Family business." "We don't have family business," Clara said. His eyes moved around the hall, taking in the scale of the house, the quality of it, making his own calculations. "Now, Clara, I know things between us ended. You sold me, Ain," she said pleasantly. "To settle a debt you spent 15 years accumulating by borrowing from my father without ever intending to pay him back. That's how it ended. What did you want?" The warmth in his expression had some difficulty now. "I find myself in a difficult position," he said, lowering his voice as though the hall had ears. It did. Actually, she was fairly certain Molly was in the corridor behind her, and Hester had not gone far. Payment of the debt had cleared the obligation, yes. But there are other obligations, other creditors, who've come forward. "No," Clara said. He blinked. "You haven't heard." "Yeah. I don't need to hear it," she said. "You're here because you've managed to run up new debts and you've come to see if the connection to Ashford Estate can be leveraged to solve them." The answer is no, Clara. His voice shifted harder now, the family warmth gone. "I kept you in my house for 2 years after your father died. I kept you fed and housed. You kept me, Aiden," she said. Because an unmarried niece in your household cost you nothing and gave you someone to manage the accounts, do the mending, and present a respectable appearance to callers. You kept me the way you keep a useful piece of furniture." She held his gaze. "And when the furniture became more valuable as a bargaining chip, you bargained with it." The hat in his hands had gone completely still. "I won't be helping you," she said. "Yeah. I want you to leave this property, and I want you to understand that coming back will not produce a different result." He stared at her for a long moment. "Your father would be ashamed," he said, low and mean. Clara felt it land. She let it land, because pretending it didn't hurt would have been a lie, and she didn't tell lies to herself. "My father," she said steadily, "would have recognized exactly what you're doing and called it by its right name. He was a better man than you, and you borrowed against his goodness for 20 years. I think you know that. I think that's why you said it." Reginald looked at her, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, something honest moved through his face. Nay, whether it was shame or simply the recognition that she was right, she couldn't be certain. Then it was gone, and he put his hat back on and turned and walked out. Clara stood in the hall until she heard the door close. Then put one hand flat against the wall and breathed. "Ma'am." It was Molly, appearing in the corridor doorway exactly as Clara had expected. The girl's face was tight with something, anger, maybe, or the particular distress of someone too young to know how to handle what she'd just witnessed. "It's all right, Molly," Clara said. "He had no right." "He doesn't, no." Clara straightened. "Is there coffee in the kitchen?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's go find some." She didn't tell William about Reginald's visit. She decided this consciously. Ader turned it over and decided it. Visit had produced nothing. Accomplished nothing. And what Reginald had said about her father was something she needed to carry herself for a while, before she could put it down cleanly. William didn't need to carry it too. What William needed, in the weeks that followed, was to focus on Graves's work on the estate claim, which was progressing, which was building something solid, and he did. With the particular intensity of a man who had finally decided to fight for something and meant to win. Clara let him fight. She managed the house. She corresponded with the household suppliers, discovered 3 of them had been overcharging for years, renegotiated the contracts, wrote to Graves about it because she thought it might be relevant to the estate's financial history, and was told by Graves that it was in fact relevant, and that she had potentially just strengthened their position. She told Ruth, who told Bess, who was so excited she forgot to disagree about the bread. And she worked in the garden, which was beginning to look not beautiful, at least intentional. Old Walter had started helping her. He appeared most mornings at the garden gate without comment or introduction, simply began working alongside her on whatever she was working on, and occasionally said things like, "That roses'll take 2 seasons to come back proper," or "Ground's too dry here, needs another foot of depth." He did not explain himself, and she did not ask for explanation, and it was the most comfortable working relationship she had formed at Ashford Estate, possibly because neither of them needed anything from it except the work itself. On a morning, in mid-August, old Walter said, without looking up from the soil, "Something's coming." Clara stopped. "What do you mean?" she said. "Don't know exactly." He sat back on his heels. "But I've worked this property 34 years. I know the feel of it when something's moving underneath." He glanced at her. "Ought to be ready." "Ready for what?" she said. He shrugged. Went back to the soil. "Ready." Clara held her trowel and thought about that for the rest of the morning. The thing that was moving underneath arrived 4 days later, and it came by post. Graves sent a letter, not a routine letter. She could tell by the way Hester handed it to her, something in Hester's expression that was carefully controlled and watching. The letter was addressed to William, but Graves had enclosed a separate note for Clara, which she had not expected, and which told her immediately that whatever the letter contained, Graves thought, she needed to be part of the response. She brought both letters to William's study and knocked. "Come in." She set them on the desk before him. He read his first. She watched his face. She watched the careful blankness of it hold and then fracture. "What is it?" she said. He set the letter down. "Daniel's representative has obtained a document. Letter allegedly written by my father, dated 6 months before his death. He was very controlled. Very still. The letter claims that my father intended the codicil to be invalid. He was pressured into signing it. That the eastern parcels were always meant to go to Daniel." He looked at Clara. "If the letter is authenticated, the codicil is void. And the estate challenge could succeed," Clara finished. "Yes. Is the letter real?" He looked at the letter in front of him for a long moment. "My father's handwriting," he said, "or something close enough to be convincing." He paused. But my father died in March 1809. This letter is dated October 1808. Ill by then. Considerably ill. He could barely... He stopped. "Barely write," Clara said quietly. "Yes." She reached across and read her letter from Graves. It was precise and careful, as Graves always was, but the core message was stark. The document needed immediate professional examination. A handwriting expert, a paper expert if possible. And they needed to move quickly, because Daniel's legal team was requesting a county hearing date and the momentum was on their side. "It's forged," Clara said. William looked at her. "I don't know that yet." "You know your father couldn't write clearly in October 1808, she said. "And you know the signature is wrong enough that you noticed it before you said anything else." So, she met his eyes. "Which means someone created this document." "No. Someone who knew enough about your father's handwriting to approximate it, but not enough to know he was too ill to have written it." He was quiet. "Who knew your father well enough to attempt this?" she said. "Many people," he said. He was stopped. Started again. "And well connected. The county knew him." He looked at the letter again. "But the letter would have required someone would have needed access to his actual papers. His correspondence, his signature. Enough examples to practice from." "Has had access to this house," Clara said, "to the study. To your father's papers." She watched him think through it. She watched the moment it arrived, the realization, moving across his face like weather. "Eleanor," he said, very quiet, almost not a sound at all. Held herself still. "She was here," he said. "After my father died. She came frequently. She said it was to support me, to help me manage the social responsibilities of the new dukedom. She was in this house for months, this study." He looked at the desk, at the drawers, at the cabinets along the wall. "She had access to everything, and she knows Daniel," Clara said. "You told me she mentioned Daniel's name at the dinner in June when she thought I wasn't paying attention." "Yeah. She said she'd seen him at the Hargrove gathering in the spring." Before the claim was filed, the silence in the room had a new texture now. "And very still. She told him when to file," Clara said. "And she gave him the document." "I can't prove that," William said. But his voice was different now, not denying, just naming the distance between what he knew and what he could demonstrate. "Not," Clara said. He looked at her. "Read my letter," she said. "What Graves says at the bottom." He picked up her letter. Read. His eyes moved to the last paragraph and stopped. "He's already contacted the paper merchant in Richmond," Clara said. "Yea. The one who supplied this house in 1808. If the paper in that letter doesn't match what your father purchased that year, then whoever forged it bought the paper somewhere else. That's a thread." William set the letter down very carefully. "You read his letter faster than I did," he said. "I read everything fast," she said. "I have a lot of practice." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the careful, measuring look, not the deep unreadable fracture, but something more direct than either. Something that was simply seeing her, all of her, the woman who had been sent to this house in a mended dress with a rope-tied suitcase, and had spent the past 7 weeks quietly paying attention to everything. He said, "Why are you doing this?" She considered the question honestly. "Because someone is trying to take something from you by lying," she said. "And I don't tolerate lies. It's not your estate." "I'm your wife," she said. "You told Eleanor that at dinner and you meant it then, and it's still true." She stood. "It's my estate too. And I don't tolerate lies about things that belong to me either." She walked to the door. "Write to Graves tonight," she said. "Tell him about Eleanor. Tell him everything, every visit, every access she had to this house. Let him find the thread. And if we're wrong," William said. "If it wasn't her, then we're wrong," Clara said. "But we're not wrong." She left. They were not wrong. Graves worked with a speed and precision that Clara found deeply satisfying. By the end of the week he had confirmed, through the Richmond paper merchant's records, that the paper used in the alleged letter did not match any supply purchased by Ashford Estate in 1808 or any surrounding year. It had been purchased, the merchant's records showed, by a separate account, an account held in the name of a Beaumont family purchasing agent. He brought this to Clara and William on a Saturday morning. He did not editorialize, he let the document speak. Study was very quiet when he finished. "She gave Daniel the document," William said. "Not a question, just a statement of fact arriving at its final position. The paper evidence places the document's origin in the Beaumont household," Graves said carefully. "Whether Miss Beaumont personally created it or facilitated its creation is a further question. But the evidence is sufficient to challenge the letter's authenticity at the county proceeding and to file a separate complaint regarding document fraud." And sat back in his chair. Clara watched him. She watched the anger move through him, not the hot, reactive kind, but the deep, kind. The kind that comes from a betrayal that has roots. Eleanor had been in this house. She had sat at that supper table. She had smiled at Clara and looked at William with the familiarity of a woman who believed she had a prior claim. And all that time she had been building something that could take this house apart. "Everything," William said. "The challenge to the letter. Fraud complaint. Everything." "Yes, Your Grace," Graves said. "And I want the county to know before the hearing. I want this on the public record, before Eleanor Beaumont has a chance to shape the story." Graves nodded. "I'll prepare the filings Monday. Today," William said. Graves gathered his papers without argument. When he was gone, William stood and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Clara stayed where she was and gave him the silence. She had learned in 7 weeks, in 4 chess games, in 100 small careful exchanges that he needed the silence sometimes. That he processed things better when the room didn't press on him. After a long moment he said, "I trusted her, for years." "I thought," he stopped. "You thought she was your friend," Clara said quietly. "I thought she was the one person in the county who..." He turned. His face was stripped of its careful management, for once not many layers, just the real ones. "She used Margaret against me, came here after Margaret died, and I let her in because I thought she was steady. Reliable. Yeah, and she was here the whole time, me, reading my father's letters, studying his handwriting, waiting for the right moment." Clara stood up. She crossed the room, she stopped in front of him. "She used your loneliness," she said. "That's what people like her do. They find the place where someone is most exposed and stand in it, looking like safety, until they need to use it." He looked at her. "It wasn't your failing," she said. "Trusting someone who seemed trustworthy is not a failing. It's just being human. I'm not good at being human," he said, and it came out with a rough edge that was almost humor, and almost grief, almost something else she didn't have a name for. "You're better at it than you think," she said. "You gave Molly a compliment about the curtain rod. You built a library. You gave a woman you didn't know a key to it because you understood in one afternoon's conversation what she needed." She held his eyes. "That's not a man who doesn't know how to be human. That's a man who stopped letting himself." The room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. He was looking at her with that direct, unguarded expression, the one that was simply seeing her. And she was close enough now that she could see, in his face, the exact shape of everything he'd been carrying. The first wife, the loneliness, years of careful management, slow and deliberate extinction of his own warmth. And underneath it, still burning, still there, the fire she'd sensed from that first afternoon. She stepped back, not because she wanted to. Because they were, and she wasn't ready to name it yet, and she didn't think he was either, and crossing unnamed thresholds, in emotional moments, was how people said things they couldn't take back. "Let Graves work," she said. "Let the proceeding come. We have the evidence. We have the truth." She looked at him steadily. "And we have each other." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't plan on any of this," he said. "No," she said. "Neither did you. Clara, Monday," she said firmly. "Graves work. Let the county hear it, and then we'll see where we are." She left the study. In the hallway out, she leaned against the wall for a moment and closed her eyes and pressed her hands flat to the plaster and breathed. Old Walter had been right. Something had been moving underneath. And now it had surfaced, fully and finely, and there was no more waiting to see what it was. It was everything: the legal fight, the fraud, Eleanor's long betrayal, and something else. Something that lived in the distance between two people standing close enough to finally stop pretending they were strangers. The hearing was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and everything would change. She pushed off the wall, went to find Hester. They had a household to run. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the longest Clara had ever lived through, and she had lived through some long ones. It wasn't the waiting that made it hard. She had learned to wait, had learned it in her father's house, when money was short and patience was the only thing that cost nothing, had learned it in Reginald's house, when endurance was the only currency she had left. She knew how to move through time that felt like standing still. What made these 3 weeks different was that she was waiting alongside someone else. And William Ashford, it turned out, was not a man who waited gracefully. He didn't become loud. He didn't pace the halls or raise his voice or do any of the theatrical things that men sometimes did when they were frightened and needed an audience for it. What he did was go very, very still, in the way that certain things went still before they broke. He worked longer hours. He answered letters faster than Graves could send them. He reviewed the estate accounts 3 times over, looking for anything that could be used against them, and, when he found the overcharging from the suppliers that Clara had already caught and renegotiated, he read the new contracts twice before setting them down. "You already handled these," he said, finding her in the library one evening. "2 weeks ago," she said. "You didn't tell me. You had enough to manage." He set the contracts on the table beside her. He looked at them. He looked at her. "Clara, this is exactly the kind of financial record that demonstrates responsible household management," she said. "No, Graves has copies." He stared at her for a long moment. "You sent them to Graves," he said. "The week I renegotiated them," she said. "I told him they might be relevant," he agreed. "You've been building the case alongside him," William said slowly. "I've been managing the household," she said. "The case is incidental." "It is not incidental," no, she said. "It isn't. But you're looking at me like I've done something unexpected, and I want you to understand this is just what I do. I pay attention. I handle things. This is not extraordinary. This is just Tuesday." He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was not staying quiet, but arriving at something. "I owe you an accounting," he said. She looked up. "Beg your pardon." "When you arrived," he said, "I told you this was a practical arrangement. I told you I had no interest in pretending. Those were my terms." He looked at the table between them. I stopped. "Try it again. I want to be honest with you." "I have not been honest. Not entirely. About William." She said. He looked up. "You don't have to say it right now," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, it will still be true after the hearing. Then, when the air is cleaner." He held her gaze. "What if I don't know how to say it after?" he said. "What if I lose the nerve?" Clara looked at him, this man who had been shaped by a stone house and a cold county and a marriage that had taken something from him he'd never quite rebuilt, and she thought, "You have never in your life lost your nerve. That is not the problem. The problem is that you have too much of it, and it runs toward the wrong things." "Then I'll ask you," she said, "directly, and you'll answer directly." That's what we do. Something moved through him, relief, she thought. The relief of a man who had been handed a structure he could function inside. "All right," he said. She picked up her book. "Go to bed," she said. "We have 17 days. He arrived 8 days before the hearing with news that split in 2 directions simultaneously, which was the way Graves always delivered things, the good and the difficult in the same breath, refusing to let either be softened by the other. The paper evidence was solid. The merchant's records were clear, independently verified, and Graves had located the Beaumont purchasing agent, who was, it turned out, willing to provide testimony about what he had been asked to buy, and when, because he had not been told what the paper was for, and had no interest in legal exposure on Eleanor Beaumont's behalf. That was the good direction. The difficult direction was Daniel. "He's not withdrawing the claim," Graves said. "Even with the fraud evidence. His representative has filed a response arguing that Daniel was not aware of the document's provenance, that he received it in good faith from a source he believed to be credible, and that the validity of the letter is a separate question from the validity of the original estate claim." William's jaw tightened. "He's separating himself from Eleanor." "Trying to," Graves said. "Whether the county board accepts that separation is the question." He's also, Graves paused, "he's made a direct appeal. A private letter to you, Your Grace, which arrived this morning. I thought it best to deliver it in person." He set a sealed letter on the desk. Looked at it. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you looked at something you already knew was going to require something from you. He opened it. Clara watched his face as he read. She watched the careful blankness hold and shift and then do something she hadn't seen before, soften. Not completely, not easily, but something in the lines of his face changed as his eyes moved down the page. He read it twice. Then he set it down and pushed it across the desk toward her without being asked. Read it. Daniel Ashford was not, the letter made abundantly clear, the man she had been imagining. She had built him over these weeks into a figure of calculated malice, a man running a coordinated scheme to dismantle his brother's estate. What the letter revealed was something messier and considerably more human. He was a man who had spent 31 years believing his father had intended him to have a portion of Ashford estate and had been by a document he'd been told was irregular. He had not investigated where the supporting document came from. He had wanted to believe it was real, and so he had believed it. Now, reading the evidence that Graves's office had made available to his representative, he was, the letter said, in plain and unpolished language, ashamed. He did not ask for the eastern parcels anymore. He asked for a meeting. Just a meeting. Between brothers who had been strangers most of their lives, and he understood if William refused, and he would not contest the decision if William did. Clara set the letter down. He didn't know, she said. He was reckless, William said. He should have. He wanted something he believed was his, and someone handed him a reason to believe it was possible. She looked at William steadily. People do that. They believe what they want to believe. It doesn't make him innocent, but it makes him something other than the enemy we were fighting. William looked at the letter. She used him too, Clara said. Eleanor, she used your loneliness to access this house. She used your father's papers to create the document, and she used Daniel's grievance to launch the claim. She didn't need to be directly involved in any of it. She just had to put the pieces in motion and step back. She knew Daniel felt excluded, William said slowly. She knew everything about this family, Clara said. That was her advantage. She'd spent years cultivating it. What do I do? William said. It came out unguarded, the question of a man who was genuinely uncertain, which was a thing she had not heard from him before, and it landed in her chest with a particular weight. Meet with him, she said. Claire, he's your brother. Half or otherwise. He spent 31 years as a stranger because the family never built a bridge. That's not entirely his fault. She paused. And at the hearing, when the board sees that you met with him, that you handled this with integrity instead of maximum legal force, it will matter. Not as a strategy, as a fact, it will show who you are. He was looking at her with that direct expression again. The one that was simply seeing her. You think about people, he said. All the time, what they're carrying, what they need. Someone has to, she said. Is that why he stopped? Why what? Why you stayed? Why you didn't just do the minimum? Manage the house, conduct yourself appropriately, maintain the arrangement. You could have. He looked at his hands. I wouldn't have blamed you. Clara thought about how to answer this honestly. 'Cause minimum arrangements produce minimum lives, she said. And I have never been able to make myself small enough to fit inside one, no matter how much easier it would have been. She held his gaze. And because the longer I was here, the more I understood that you weren't asking me to be small. You just hadn't figured out how to ask me to be anything else. The silence in the study was warm. That was the word for it, warm, in a house that had been cold for a very long time. To Daniel, she said, tell him you'll see him. Before the hearing. Give him the chance to do something right. She stood, and William. He looked up. When this is over, she said, and the air is cleaner, I'm going to ask you that question. He understood her. She could see it in his face. I'll have an answer ready, he said. Daniel Ashford arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days before the hearing. Clara did not attend the meeting. That had been her decision. He stated clearly and without debate. This was between brothers, and some conversations needed to happen without witnesses. She gave William the study and took herself to the garden where old Walter was working on the rose beds, and she pulled weeds and did not try to hear anything through the study window, which was on the opposite side of the house anyway. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When William came to find her in the garden, his face was different in a way she couldn't entirely name. Not lighter, exactly. More like a man who had set down something very heavy and was still feeling the absence of the weight. How was it, she said. He cried, William said. He seemed almost surprised by this. Not dramatically. Just at a certain point he stopped talking and he shook his head. He said he never meant to hurt the estate. He said he wanted to know his father had thought of him. Even once, Clara set down her trowel. Their father, she said carefully, did he? I don't know, William said. He never spoke to me about Daniel. I was 14 when his second wife died and Daniel was sent to Georgia, and I was in my own grief about my mother. I don't know what our father felt about him. He paused. I told him that I didn't know, that I couldn't tell him what our father intended, because I genuinely didn't know. That was honest, Clara said. He said it was the most honest thing anyone in this family had ever said to him, William said quietly. Then he cried. Clara absorbed this. Are you all right? She said. Me. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most real one, the one beneath all the careful management. I'm not sure what all right means in this context. I met a man today who has been a stranger my entire life, and he turned out to be, he stopped. Someone who was also just trying to understand where he belonged. Yes, Clara said. I invited him to stay for supper, William said. Is that, he looked at her. I should have asked you first. Clara stared at him for a moment. Then she said, of course he should stay for supper. Go tell Hester. Something crossed his face she was almost certain the beginning of a smile. Brief and real. He went to find Hester. Clara stood in the garden in the August afternoon and thought, there it is again. A little brighter this time. Supper that evening was the strangest meal Clara had sat through in her life, and she had sat through some strange ones. Daniel Ashford was nothing like William to look at, shorter, broader, with open features, and a manner that telegraphed everything he felt, which was the opposite of his brother in almost every way. He was clearly nervous, and clearly trying not to show it and failing entirely, which Clara found oddly endearing. He addressed her as Mrs. Ashford with careful formality, and she watched him throughout the meal, trying to figure out what she was and how she had happened, and finally she said, Nay, you can ask. He blinked. I beg your pardon? Whatever you're trying to work out, she said. About how I came to be here, you can ask. I'll answer. He glanced at William, who gave him nothing. I heard, that is. Eleanor told me he stopped. Reconsidered. I heard the circumstances were unconventional. Uncle told me to pay his debt, Clara said pleasantly. William paid the debt and I married him. It was unconventional, yes. Daniel stared at her. And you're all right, he said. That. I'm considerably more than all right, she said. Though it took some time to get here. Daniel looked at William again. This time William was looking at Clara with an expression Daniel clearly didn't know how to read, and Clara did. She had learned its language by now, its grammar and its vocabulary, and what it said was, yeah. Is. Considerably more than all right. Eleanor's told me, Daniel said carefully, that William married you purely for financial convenience. That there was no he stopped. I'm sorry. I'm handling this badly. Eleanor, William said, setting down his fork, Net told you what she needed you to believe. She's been doing that for a long time. The table went quiet. Daniel said. He looked at his plate. I know that now. And he looked up. I want to say to both of you that I am sorry for not verifying what she gave me. I should have come to you directly. He looked at William. I should have come to you 6 years ago, when Father died. I shouldn't have let us stay strangers. William was quiet for a moment. No, he said, neither should I. It wasn't forgiveness. Clara understood that. It was something that came before forgiveness, acknowledgement. Recognition that two people had both, in their separate ways, failed to build something they both needed. That was harder than forgiveness in some ways, more honest. She picked up her wine glass. Well, she said, you're here now. Daniel looked at her. Something in his face relaxed, a decision being made, she thought, about whether she was safe. He decided she was, he said. I suppose I am. The hearing arrived on a Thursday morning at the Harrowfield County Courthouse, and the county arrived with it. Clara had underestimated, she realized, how much interest the community had accumulated in this proceeding. Room was full, not chaotically, but fully, the kind of attendance that spoke to long-standing appetite for resolution. The Ashford estate challenge had been county gossip for months. Eleanor Beaumont was known here. So was William. And Clara, the woman who had arrived as a debt payment and had been the subject of considerable speculation since, was known now too, though. What people knew of her varied, according to who was telling the story. She sat beside William at the front table. Graves was to William's left, his papers stacked with characteristic precision. Daniel sat 3 rows back, having formally withdrawn his claim the previous day, which had sent a wave through the county that had not yet finished moving. Fraud was on the record. The fraud complaint was on the record. All that remained was the board's formal finding, and Eleanor Beaumont's response. She was there. Clara had known. She would be. Eleanor was not the kind of woman who avoided rooms where her reputation was being decided. She sat in the 3rd row with 2 women Clara recognized as county social fixtures, and she was dressed immaculately, and her expression was composed with the precision of someone who had spent the past week deciding how to perform this. The board chairman, a man named Aldridge, who had the look of someone who had presided over enough county proceedings to be genuinely past being surprised by people, opened the session and moved through the preliminary record with efficient dispatch. The withdrawal of the estate claim. The fraud complaint. The paper merchant's testimony, delivered in a signed statement because the merchant himself was in Richmond and Graves had arranged it correctly. The purchasing agent's testimony, delivered in person, which was more effective. Clara watched Eleanor's face through all of it. The composure held. She was very good. But there was something underneath it, a fine, careful tension, like a rope pulled to the edge of its capacity. Aldridge said, "The board will hear any response from parties named in the fraud complaint." Eleanor's attorney stood. He was smooth and prepared and delivered a careful argument about the provenance of the document, about his client's lack of direct involvement in its creation, about the absence of documentation directly connecting Miss Beaumont to the forgery. He spoke for 12 minutes. When he sat down, Graves stood. Graves spoke for 4. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He laid the evidence out in the order it occurred, in the plain language of documented fact, and when he was done there was a silence in the room that had weight to it. Aldridge looked at Eleanor. "Miss Beaumont," he said. "Do you wish to address the board directly?" Eleanor stood. She looked at the board. She looked at the room. And for one moment, one brief, unguarded moment, her eyes moved to William, and Clara saw in that look everything Eleanor had believed and wanted and built this entire structure around, that William was hers. That he had always been hers. That the woman sitting beside him was an interruption, a practical arrangement, a temporary condition. And her eyes moved to Clara. And Clara looked back at her steadily and did not move and did not look away and did not give her anything. Eleanor looked back at the board. "I have nothing to add," she said. She sat down. The board conferred for 22 minutes. They returned a finding of document fraud. They referred the matter to the county sheriff for further investigation. They issued a formal censure of the conduct of the estate challenge. And they noted, for the record, that the Ashford estate's legal standing was confirmed and undisputed. Aldridge brought his gavel down. The room exhaled. William turned to Graves and shook his hand. Graves accepted this with his characteristic controlled dignity and said something quiet about the strength of the paper evidence. Clara shook Graves's hand too, and Graves held it a moment longer than necessary and said, "Well done, Mrs. Ashford," and she understood what he meant and was more moved by it than she'd expected. She turned. Daniel was standing behind them. He looked relieved, she thought. And something else, something younger, like a man who had arrived at a place he wasn't sure existed and found it was real. He looked at. William looked at him. Then William extended his hand. Daniel shook it, and then, because he was Daniel and not William and could not help himself, he pulled William into a brief embrace that Williams clearly did not expect, and responded to with the careful stiffness of a man whose body had forgotten how to receive that kind of thing. Clara looked away to give them that moment. She found Hester at the back of the room, because of course Hester was there, because Hester had been in this house for 19 years and knew better than anyone what this day meant for it. Esther looked at her. Well, Hester said. Well, Clara agreed. Roses, Hester said, are going to look very fine by next summer. Old Walter says so. Clara smiled. I'll hold him to it. They rode back to Ashford Estate in the late afternoon. Clara and William in the carriage, the county falling away behind them, and the long oak drive coming up ahead. Neither of them spoke for most of it, and the silence was the easy kind, the kind that only existed between people who had stopped needing to fill it. Carriage stopped. They went inside. Hester and the staff were already home. Thomas had taken the groom's carriage at speed, apparently, and word had gotten there ahead of them, because when Clara and William came through the door, the household staff was assembled in the front hall in what appeared to be a spontaneous and slightly ceremonial way. Molly was practically vibrating. Ruth was crying without appearing to notice she was crying. Bess was pretending not to look at Ruth. Old Walter was in the back, as usual. Saying nothing, he gave Clara a nod that carried 34 years of Ashford Estate in it. William looked at all of them. Then he said, I believe supper can be a celebration tonight if Ruth is willing. Ruth made a sound that was essentially a yes and swept back to the kitchen immediately, Bess at her heels. The hall dispersed. Clara and William were left in it alone. Clara, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had been waiting for, not the careful one, not the measuring one, not the fractured one. The clear one, the one with everything in it. You said, he said, that when the air was cleaner, you'd ask me the question. I did say that, she said. Ask it, he said. She looked at him. She thought about the morning she arrived in a mended dress with a rope-tied suitcase. She thought about a key on a table and a library door, and chess games and curtain rods and forged letters and a garden that had been neglected for 2 summers and was coming back. You want this, she said. Not the arrangement. Not the contract, not the practical solution. She held his eyes. Me, here, in this house, as something real. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. I have wanted it for longer than I knew what to call it. Breathed. Then stop managing it, she said. Stop keeping it at measured distance. Stop making decisions about what you're allowed to feel. She took 1 step toward him. Just feel it. That's all I'm asking. He crossed the remaining distance. And William Ashford, who had not held anyone in 6 years and had stopped believing he wanted to, put his hands gently on either side of Clara's face and rested his forehead against hers and stayed there. Not a kiss. Not yet. Just that the simplest possible acknowledgement of 2 people choosing each other with their eyes open, in the entrance hall of a house that had finally quietly, after a very long time, remembered what warmth felt like. Clara put her hand against his chest, over his heart. It beating, fast, real. All right, she said softly. All right, he said. Outside, the August evening was settling over Harrowfield County. The oaks along the drive were still. In the kitchen, Ruth was creating a celebration supper with considerable feeling. In the garden, the roses were not yet blooming, but old Walter had said they would be, and old Walter was never wrong about things that grew. Inside the front hall, 2 people stood together in the quiet and let themselves be finally, exactly where they were. The morning after the hearing, Clara woke before the household did. She lay still for a moment in the blue-gray light and listened to Ashford Estate breathe the particular quiet of a large house in the hour before anyone else had claimed it, when the building was entirely itself, without performance or occasion. She had come to love this hour. She had come to love it the way you loved something you hadn't expected to, something that crept up on you while you were busy surviving other things. She dressed without rushing, went downstairs. Put the kettle on herself because it was early, and Ruth needed sleep, and Clara had spent enough years of her life making her own coffee in her own kitchen that doing it in someone else's felt perfectly natural. Her cup to the garden, old Walter was already there. She was no longer surprised by this. She had stopped being surprised by old Walter weeks ago. He was simply always present when the garden needed him, in the way certain people were present when things needed doing, not dramatically, not with announcement, air. Just morning, he said, without looking up. Morning, she said. She sat on the stone bench near the east bed and drank her coffee and watched him work, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she knew. After a while he said, without stopping, heard it went right. Did, she said. Reckoned it would. He turned a fistful of soil. She's a persistent woman, that Beaumont. But persistent wrong is still wrong. It runs out eventually. It did, Clara said again. Yeah. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd been waiting for a long time to have confirmed. Roses'll need cutting back before frost, he said. You'll want to do it before mid-October. Show me how, she said. Eh? He looked up at her, then really looked at her the way he rarely did, old Walter preferring conduct most of his meaningful communication at an angle. You aimin' to be here come October, he said. It was not quite a question. Am, she said. He nodded once with the gravity of a man receiving an oath. Then, I'll show you. She finished her coffee. The estate was beginning to wake around her. She could hear Thomas in the stable yard, and above her a window opened on the second floor that she recognized as William's. And she didn't look up. She knew he was there, and knowing was enough. She set her cup on the bench and went back to work. What followed in the days after the hearing was something Clara had not anticipated and could not have predicted from any of the weeks that preceded it. Life. Simply, quietly, genuinely, life. Not the performing of life, not the management of it from the cautious distance she and William had been maintaining since June. Not the careful arrangement of two people in the same house who had agreed to share it, but not quite agreed to inhabit it together. Actual life. The kind where things happened and were spoken about and reacted to by people who were not trying to protect themselves from the reaction. Started small, the way important things always did. Breakfast. The morning after the hearing, William came down at his usual 10 to 7 and found Clara at the table already, and instead of taking his end of the table and the newspaper, he sat beside her. Not across, beside, and said without preamble, Daniel wrote to me last night. He'd like to visit again, next month. Good, Clara said, without looking up from her own letter. Tell him he's welcome. You don't mind. Why would I mind? He's a stranger, essentially. She looked up. He's your brother. Essentially. She held his eyes. Tell him he's welcome, William. He wrote the letter after breakfast. He read the reply 2 days later, sitting beside her in the library. And the reply was warm enough that Clara had to look at the window for a moment to avoid showing William what she felt about the fact that two brothers who had spent 30 years being strangers were writing warm letters. He's come in September, William said. Then we'll need to have the east guest room properly aired, she said. Hester, I'll tell Hester. He was quiet for a moment. You do that. You take things and you handle them before I've finished the thought. Is that a complaint? She said. No, he said, and the way he said it made her look at him directly, and what she found on his face was something she'd been watching build for months and hadn't let herself fully name: open, uncomplicated appreciation. The look of a man who had spent years being adequate in his own estimation, had stopped expecting to be genuinely known, and had discovered, to his own confusion and considerable relief, that he was. Get used to it, she said lightly. I'm not sure I want to, he said. Get used to it, I mean. I think I'd rather notice it every time. Clara looked back at her book. She was smiling. She didn't try to stop it. The county noticed. This was inevitable. It was a county that made noticing its primary occupation, and Clara had prepared herself for the second wave of opinion that would come once the hearing was done, and people had time to reshuffle their positions. She expected some of the colder families to warm slightly, opportunistically, now that the Ashford estate was confirmed and secure. She expected others to hold their distance as a matter of pride. Expected Eleanor Beaumont's circle to contract in position, which it did, with the efficiency of people who had been in social retreat before and knew the choreography. What she did not expect was Mrs. Hargrove. The woman arrived at Ashford Estate on a Tuesday afternoon in September, with no announcement and no apparent irony about her previous positions, and asked to see Mrs. Ashford. Hester came to find Clara in the garden, with an expression on her face that was doing complicated work. "She's in the front parlor," Hester said. "I didn't know whether to I'll go," Clara said. She went in without changing her dress or washing the garden dirt from her hands, which was a decision she made consciously and without apology. Mrs. Hargrove was a woman in her mid-60s, formidably constructed and dressed in the way of women who had never once in their lives been unsure of their standing. She was sitting in the front parlor with the posture of someone who had also never been unsure of their chair. She looked at Clara's garden-dirty hands and managed impressively not to visibly react. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove," Clara said. Did not sit. She stood, which made the power of the room level. "What can I do for you?" "I came," Mrs. Hargrove said, with the air of a woman delivering a concession she had rehearsed, "that I believe I was improperly informed about certain matters concerning your arrival in this household, and concerning your character." "By Eleanor Beaumont," Clara said. A pause by more than one source, but primarily yes. "And now, Mrs. Hargrove said, I have watched you manage this household through a legal challenge that would have undone a lesser woman, the negotiate supplier contracts that 3 previous household managers failed to address, and stand beside your husband in a public proceeding with more composure than many women of considerably greater privilege manage in ordinary circumstances." She straightened, which Clara would not have thought possible. She was already so straight. "I was wrong about you." Clara looked at her steadily. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. "In person." "It seemed appropriate to do it in person," Mrs. Hargrove said, with what appeared to be genuine discomfort. "Given that the damage was done in person, and otherwise." "A beat. Will you sit down?" Clara said. "I'll have Molly bring coffee." Mrs. Hargrove sat. Clara went to find Molly. She did not tell William about the visit immediately. She sat with it for a day, ate her, turned it over, decided it was real, and then told him at supper in the same tone she used to report anything else of household interest. Listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "came here, sat in the parlor for 40 minutes, Clara said. Had 2 cups of coffee, asked me about the garden. Left with what I believe was genuine goodwill." "Good God," William said. "She's not a bad woman," Clara said. "She was operating on bad information. Once she had better information, she corrected herself." She paused. "That's more than a lot of people manage." He looked at her across the supper table. "You give people a great deal of credit." "I give them the credit they earn," she said. "No more, no less. What credit do I earn?" he said, and there was something in it, not quite teasing, something more exposed than that. It considered him, this man. This particular, difficult, careful, deeply feeling, badly defended man who had sat across from her over 4 chess games, and a library and a legal proceeding and 100 small moments, and had been coming back to himself, slowly and stubbornly. The way things came back that had been cold for too long. "You're still earning it," she said. "Ask me in 10 years. He smiled. She had seen him smile before, brief, real, gone quickly. This one stayed. It stayed long enough for her to see what his face was like when it was all the way open, and she thought, there. That's what was under all that stone. That was always there. "In years," he said. "All right." The twist she hadn't seen coming arrived on a Thursday in late September, delivered by Graves in a letter that began with the words, "There is a development in the Beaumont matter that requires your attention." Clara read it first. William was in the East Fields with Thomas reviewing fencing work, which was the kind of thing he had started doing more getting out of the study and into the actual property, learning it with his hands rather than through accounts. He had not commented on this directly. She had simply noticed it and been glad. She read Graves's letter twice, then she went to find William. He read it in the stable yard, standing with the afternoon light on his face. She watched him go through it, and watched the careful blankness return briefly, the old reflex, the old management, and then watched him set it down. She's left the county, he said. Graves says she left last week, Clara said. Quietly, her family's property in Richmond. He doesn't think she's coming back. The fraud investigation is continuing. Her departure doesn't stop it. Graves says the county sheriff is coordinating with Richmond. May take time. But she's gone. William looked at the letter in his hand. Clara watched the emotions move through him. She could read them now, had learned the grammar of his face over months of close attention. Relief, yes, but also something complicated, something that had a grief shape. She was my friend, he said, not defensively, just as a fact that still hurt. I thought she was my friend. I know, Clara said. Years, he said. I trusted her with. He stopped. I told her things. About Margaret, about the estate. I told her about you. When Cook first brought the arrangement to me. I told her I was considering it, and she said, he stopped again. What did she say? Clara said. She said it was practical, he said slowly. She said it made sense. She encouraged me to proceed. He looked at Clara with an expression that was arriving at something new, something he hadn't connected until this moment. Encouraged me to marry you. The stable yard was quiet. Yeah. Clara thought about this. She thought about Eleanor Beaumont, who had wanted William for years, who had been circling Ashford Estate, with the patience of someone who believed she would eventually be invited in. Who had, when William proposed the debt arrangement, seen what? A distraction. A temporary complication. A woman who would be easy to remove once the time came. Who had encouraged the marriage because she believed Clara was exactly what William had said she was, a practical arrangement. Something temporary. She had never imagined that a merchant's daughter in a mended dress would turn out to be the thing that stayed. She miscalculated, Clara said. Yes, William said. She thought she knew what you needed, Clara said. She thought she understood you well enough to use your loneliness against you. But she didn't actually understand you, because if she had, she would have known that what you needed was someone who wouldn't pretend. She met his eyes. And she was never going to stop pretending. He looked at her for a long time. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask. The morning you arrived, he said. The first morning, when you told me you did not buy me. Afraid. She considered lying. It would have been easy. It would have been the graceful answer. Terrified, she said. You didn't look it. I know, she said. I've been told my face doesn't cooperate with my interior state. It's cooperative enough, he said. To anyone paying attention. Were you paying attention, she said, that first day? I have been paying attention, he said, since the moment you stepped out of that carriage without waiting for assistance. He held his gaze. Good, she said. He put his hand over hers, standing there in the stable yard with Thomas somewhere out of earshot, September afternoon going golden around them, and held it the way you held something you were no longer afraid of losing. You had finally, fully decided to hold on. There, he said. Yes. I love you. And it came out simply, without ceremony, in the voice of a man who had located a true thing, and was stating it the way he stated all true things directly, without performance, because it deserved that much at least. I don't know precisely when it happened, but it happened. And I think you should know. Clara looked at him. She thought about the iron key on the table, about the library, about chess games and forged letters and a brother in the guest room and roses that weren't blooming yet but would be. About a supper table where someone had finally said she is my wife and meant every word of it. About a man who had given her a room within a room and asked her to need nothing and found out, to his own considerable confusion, that what she actually gave him was everything. I know, she said. I've known for a while, and he said. She turned her hand over and held his back. And I love you, she said. I think I started somewhere around the fourth chess game. Possibly the third. I won't concede the exact moment. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a real one, low and warm, surprised out of him. Nay, she thought it might be the finest sound she had heard in her 23 years. He said, You won that one. I know, she said. It seemed like a good time. Daniel arrived in the last week of September as promised, and this time he was not nervous. He came up the oak drive and stepped down from his carriage and shook William's hand and then turned to Clara and said, with the directness of a man who had decided they were past the careful part, "I brought you some." He produced from his coat a book. It worn leather cover. It used. The title faded but legible. A collected volume of American legal history. Published in 1808. I didn't know what you liked, he said. So I asked William. He said law and chess. I couldn't bring a chess set without implying I wanted to play, and William tells me you'd beat me inside 20 minutes, so. Clara took the book. She turned it over. She looked at Daniel Ashford, this broad-faced, open-hearted man who cried when things were real and laughed when things were true, and had spent 31 years being a stranger to his own family. Thank you, she said, and meant it entirely. Also, he said, slightly more carefully, I owe you an apology. Separate from the legal business. The things Eleanor told me about you, I repeated some of them. To people here, in the county, before the hearing. I didn't know they were lies, but I said them. Clara looked at him steadily. Who did you say them to? She said. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, with the expression of a man delivering himself to a justified consequence. And 2 of her regular callers, and possibly the postmaster. I was making a case for Daniel's legitimacy, and it was wrong of me. It was, Clara agreed. I intend to correct it, he said. With each of those people. Mrs. Hargrove has already come to see me, Clara said. She has? She apologized in person, Clara said. I had coffee with her. She's actually quite interesting when she's not operating on bad intelligence. She paused. Do it soon, and then it's done. He nodded, with the expression of a man being let off more lightly than he deserved, and knowing it. Yes, ma'am. Clara looked at her book. Come inside, she said. Esther's been cooking since noon. He came inside. September turned to October, the way Virginia's seasons turned, not gradually, not with notice. Just differently one morning when you went out, and the air had decided to become something else. Clara noticed it in the garden, where she and old Walter were doing the pre-frost rosework he'd promised to show her, and the way the light came through differently, lower and more amber, catching the last of the late-season color before the cold arrived. There, old Walter said, showing her the angle of it, the placement, the way you reduced without damaging. Leave too much and the frost takes it. Take too much and it doesn't come back strong. How do you know how much is right, she said. Experience, he said. And attention. He looked at her sideways, same as most things. The cut. He watched, he said nothing, which meant she'd done it right. They worked in silence for a while. Then old Walter said, without inflection, he's different. Clara did not pretend not to know who he meant. Yes, she said. 34 years I've worked this property, old Walter said. His mother, God rest her, seen him as a boy, he worked steadily. He was a good boy before he got careful. He's careful less often now, Clara said. No, old Walter said, he's careful same as always. He just stopped being only careful. He sat back on his heels and looked at the bed they'd worked. That's you. Clara opened her mouth to say something modest and true and slightly deflecting. Don't, old Walter said mildly, before she could. No, old. I've earned the right to say a thing plainly. She closed her mouth. Yes, she said instead. I hope so. No hope about it, he said, and went back to work. The county formal gathering in October was the first one Clara attended as something other than a subject of scrutiny. She had attended 2 previous events in July and August, in the careful posture of a woman being watched and knowing it, managing herself with precision, saying the right things in the right tone, presenting nothing that could be used. It had been exhausting in the way of things that required constant internal management, and she had come home from both events and sat in the library for an hour before she could sleep. This one was different. She knew it immediately. When they arrived, the quality of attention had changed. Not the quantity the county still watched, would probably always watch. Some things were unchangeable, but the quality. The watching now had something new in it. Respect, she thought, was too formal a word for it. Recognition was closer. The recognition of people who had observed something long enough to form an honest opinion. Mrs. Hargrove stopped her in the first 10 minutes and introduced her to 3 women as my good friend Mrs. Ashford, which was an exaggeration of the current relationship, but not an, Clara thought, aspiration beyond reach. She shook hands and spoke and was spoken to, and moved through the room with William beside her, not performatively, not presenting them as a public arrangement. Just beside her, someone stood beside a person they had chosen. Someone she didn't see who said to him, "Your wife, Duke, she's remarkable." And William said, without pause, without qualification, "She is." Know it. Clara did not react. She was in the middle of a conversation about estate management with a man from the northern county, and she kept her attention there, kept her voice even, did not allow herself to be visibly moved by something said about her across a room. And she kept it, near. There was a moment, mid-evening, when she found herself standing briefly alone, William in conversation with Graves about something she didn't need to be part of. Daniel across the room talking to people he was apparently in the process of apologizing to. Hester having verbally attended, and a woman she hadn't met yet came to stand beside her. Young. Clara's age, maybe a year younger, a quiet face with bright watchful eyes. "I'm Margaret Sellers," she said. "I've been wanting to meet you." "Clara Ashford," Clara said. "I know who you are," Margaret Sellers said. "County knows who you are." She paused. "I wanted to tell you my situation isn't unlike yours was." "My father's affairs," or she stopped, looked at her hands. "I'm not certain what's going to happen next." Clara looked at her directly. "What do you need?" she said. Margaret Sellers blinked surprised. Clara thought to have been asked so cleanly, without prelude or politeness. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I need to know it's possible to come through something like this and be still yourself." The other side. Clara thought about a mended blue dress and a rope-tied suitcase and an iron key on a table and a library door. Nay, she thought about what it had cost to walk through that door and what it had given her, things she hadn't known she needed until they were there. "Possible," she said. "It costs something. But you come through still yourself." I promise you that." Margaret Sellers looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to believe something they badly wanted to believe. "How?" she said. "You decide not to be made small," Clara said. "Every time, every room, every person who looks at you like you're less. You decide again, I am not less, and eventually," she paused. "Eventually it stops being a decision. It just becomes true." The young woman was quiet. "Thank you," she said. "Come see me," Clara said. "Next week if you like. We'll have coffee." Margaret Sellers looked at her with something that was going to be gratitude but wasn't quite yet, still in the stage of being surprised it was offered. "All right," she said. They drove home late, the October night cool and clear above them. William sat beside her in the carriage the way he always did now beside her, not across, and the silence between them was full of the evening. Everything that had happened and was still and would continue to happen in all the mornings and suppers, and chess games and garden mornings that lay ahead. "Who was the woman you spoke to?" he said, near the end. "Margaret Sellers," Clara said. "Her father's in financial difficulty." "She's frightened." "Is she?" "I asked her to come for coffee next week," Clara said. "I thought she could use someone to talk to." He was quiet for a moment. "You do that too," he said. "Do what?" "Take people in," he said. "Not literally, but you see them, and you let them know you see them." And he paused. "It changes something, for them." Clara thought about Molly hanging a curtain rod taller than she'd started. About Ruth defending her honor to Bess in the kitchen. About old Walter saying "that's you" in the garden, like it was a settled and permanent truth. "I don't do anything remarkable," she said. "I just pay attention." "Clara," he said, and there was something in her name, in his voice, that was different from all the other times, fuller, she thought. More certain of itself. There is nothing ordinary about what you do. I want you to know that. I want you to stop treating it as ordinary. At him in the dim carriage. Noted, she said. I mean it. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm not arguing. He put his arm around her shoulders, simply, easily, the way he'd been doing things lately that would once have required effort, and now just happened, because he'd stopped deliberating about them. She leaned into him. The carriage moved through the Virginia night. Roses will bloom in the spring, she said. Old Walter says so, he said. Old Walter is never wrong about things that grow. No, he said. He isn't. Oaks were dark on either side of the drive, a state appearing ahead in the early moonlight, and it was the most familiar sight in the world to her, now this house, these trees, this particular angle of approach. She had arrived in summer not knowing what it was. Nah. She knew now. Nay. She had learned it the way she learned everything, by paying attention, by staying, by deciding every day not to be made small. Ashford Estate was still a house of stone and iron and old wood. It had not changed in its bones, but it had warmth in it now. Everyone who worked there felt it, been feeling it build since June, like a fire that starts as an ember and expands outward, room by room, until the cold is simply gone and what's there instead is light. Clara had not set out to give that. She had set out to survive, to keep herself intact through a situation she hadn't chosen, to hold on to her own name and her own mind and her own dignity while everything around her was arranged by people who hadn't asked her. She had done that, and somewhere along the way, in the library and the garden and the kitchen and the stable yard and 100 small true moments between a man and a woman who had agreed to share a life and discovered they were actually sharing one somewhere in all of that, she had also given this house back to itself. She had given William Ashford back to himself, not because she set out to. Not because she was extraordinary or saintly or perfect, because she was none of those things. She was stubborn and direct, and occasionally too blunt, and had been known to win chess games with unnecessary decisiveness. But because she was real, and real, it turned out, was the thing this house had been missing longest. The carriage stopped. William helped her down, had been doing this now, not as ceremony but as care, which was different, and she felt the difference every time. They walked to the door together. Hester had left the lamp burning in the front hall, which was a thing Hester had started doing, without being asked. Inside, the house breathed its quiet breath. I want to ask you something, Clara said. Ask, he said. Are you happy, she said. Not are you satisfied, or are you content, or any of the careful measured words that stood in for the real one. Are you happy? The question she had been carrying for months, and had finally decided he was ready to hear, and she was ready to ask. He looked at her in the lamplight of the front hall of Ashford Estate, and his face was entirely open, no management, no distance, no careful stone. Just him. Just this. Yes, he said, I am happy. He looked at her the way she had come to understand meant fully, without reservation, without performance. I have not been happy in a very long time. I had forgotten what it required. He paused. It required you. Clara held that. She let it be what it was, not minimized, not qualified, not tucked away somewhere safe. She let it land fully and stay. Good, she said. She took his hand. She led him toward the library. Because that was where they always ended up eventually, the two of them in the room he had given her a key to before he knew what it meant, in the room that had been hers first and was now theirs, where the fire was banked and the lamp was ready. The chessboard was on the side table waiting, as it always was, for whoever wanted to play first. And in Harrowfield County, Virginia, in the autumn of 1815, in a house that had been cold for too long, and was cold no longer, two people who had begun as attraction at and become something neither of them had the words for, at the start, settled into the life they had built from the unlikely materials of debt and dignity and stubbornness and chess, and a garden coming back to bloom, and were, without question, without performance, without a single pretense between them, exactly where they were supposed to be. A person could lose money. They could lose status. They could lose the name their family gave them, and the house they were born in, and the future they believed was theirs. But no one, no debt, no scheme, no cold county and its colder opinions could take away what a person carried inside themselves when they decided every day, in every room, against every pressure, I am not less. I was never less. I am entirely myself, and that is sufficient. And that is enough, and that will always be enough. Clara Whitmore had known this before she arrived at Ashford Estate. She had simply given William Ashford the gift of learning it too. That, more than the cleared debt, more than the legal victory, than the roses that would bloom in the spring, and the brother who would come again in the fall, and the county that was slowly, stubbornly, coming around to the truth, that was the real beginning. Not the transaction, not the arrangement, the beginning.